Now let's move on to the next exercise, where we get to bind this cool looking UI with some data to see those values filled up. When we were first designing the UI, we set those view texts to string resources just to help us design and build that UI. But to display actual data that can change from one user to the other, we need to be able to modify those text values programmatically. In earlier lessons and exercises, we managed to do so by using the find view by ID and then setting the text to something or changing any attribute. This time, however, we're going to use something new. Android offers a really cool library called the Data Binding Library. This can help us link any UI with actual data without having to call the find view by ID for every view item. Let's see how to use this. First thing, make sure you're using the latest Android Studio, or at least something that's later than 2.1, so that it can actually support data binding. These here are the steps that we're going to go through to connect real data to our UI using data binding. The first step is to enable data binding in our application. To do that, open up the build.gradle file, and inside the Android section, make sure to set the data binding.enabled to true, and then sync to update your project. In this exercise, we've already created a class for you that can hold all the data you need to bind to the UI. It's called the boarding pass info. And it's a simple plain old Java object which simply acts as a placeholder for the actual data. Ideally, this will be filled with data from, say, an airline API or some database lookup. But for simplicity, we've provided you with another fake data utils class that just generates random information and fills up our plain old Java object. The second step is to change the root tag in our layout XML to use a layout tag. Android automatically generates a binding class for any layout that includes this tag as its root, and we will need those binding classes later. So let's go ahead and open our activity_main.xml and then surround this with a layout tag, and then let's copy those definitions up here and make sure to close our layout all the way at the end. This way we've surrounded our scroll view tag, making our root tag this layout tag. Once we're done with that, make sure to rebuild our project to create those binding classes for us. Perfect. Next, we'll be creating something called a binding instance. This will help us access those UI components from the code. Open up the main activity and create a variable from the type activity_main_binding. This is the class that was generated for us based on the name of the layout. So activity_main becomes main activity binding. Whatever you named your layout, the class would follow the same convention. The following step is to point the data binding instance to the correct content view. This is done using the data binding util class by calling the setContentView and passing in the actual main activity. This sets the context of our binding class to the elements in the layout we just passed. Next, let's try to generate some fake data using the fake data utils class that we've provided. And let's put them in a boarding pass info class called fake boarding info. The final step is to actually bind the data one by one using that binding instance we just created. Simply go through the attributes in the binding object one by one and set the text values to our fake data object. We're doing this in the function display boarding pass info, where we pass in this fake object called info, and then we could set the passenger name, the airport and flight code information, and then we could do some formatting for our times and set the values for those as well. And then finally our gate and terminal information down here. And then the very last step is going back to the onCreate method and calling this display boarding pass info, passing in our fake data. Now if we run this app, voila, we get our design filled with actual data.